welcome to this talk organized by the Modern History Research Center at the University of Winchester in the UK in partnership with the Hispanic-Anglosphere project. And today, Dr. Rodrigo Escribano Roca will introduce his latest book, Memorias del viejo imperio, Hispanoamérica en las culturas políticas de España y el Reino Unido, 1824 a 1850, that was published just this year. And this is a study of the impact of Spanish-American independence on the political cultures of Spain and the United Kingdom. And Dr. Rodrigo Escribano Roca is director of the Center of American Studies at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Chile. In 2019, he was awarded a doctorate in philosophy at the School of Humanities and Communication Arts in Western Sydney University in Australia. And he got a similar degree under the banner Latin America and the European Union in the international context by the Instituto Universitario de Investigación en Estudios Latinoamericanos in the Universidad de Alcalá in Spain. And he's head researcher of the Chilean National Research and Scientific Development and Technology Project, the Pacific Expedition, and the Spanish-South American War in the Geopolitical Imaginaries of Liberal Spain, 1860 to 1866. And he has also published extensively in many prestigious journals like the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, the Anuario de Estudios Americanos, Historia Constitucional, and Filosofía. And we also have today here among us, who is going to be acting as discussant, Dr. James Sanders, who is Director of Graduate Studies at Utah State University. Yes, hello. And he teaches Latin America and Latin American history, and his current project is focusing on rethinking the relation between capitalism and democracy in the 19th century Americas and on challenging notions of American exceptionalism. So we're going to start with Rodrigo's talks that is going to last around 40 minutes. Then Dr. James Sanders will give us a brief talk, perhaps with a few questions to start the conversation. And then we're going to start the question and answer session. And everybody's welcome to either raise the hand through the Teams facility of reactions or writing in the chat. Hopefully the chat will be working and everybody will be able to use it. So please, Rodrigo, go ahead. You're most welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Graciela. Hello, everyone. First of all, I must thank the Modern History Research Center and the Hispanic-Anglosphere project for organizing the event. I am particularly grateful to Graciela Iglesias Rogers, obviously, for her invitation. I think the text I am about to present represents the intellectual concerns of the Hispanic-Anglosphere very well. After all, the book explains the role of the Spanish-American revolutions in shaping the political imagination of Spain and the United Kingdom. In other words, it addresses a critical dimension of the ideological interactions between the Hispanic and Anglo-Saxon worlds. Even the birth of the book would be a suitable object of study for the Hispanic-Anglosphere, since I, a Spaniard, wrote the first draft in Sydney in the Anglo-Saxon world. My presentation today could also be analyzed by Hispanic-Anglosphere researchers, since given my lack of practice, I will speak in Spanglish or a very lousy English, for which I apologize in advance. The book is the result of my doctoral thesis, as you know. This thesis took place in the doctoral programs, as Graciela told to you a minute earlier, in the programs of the School of Humanities and Communication Arts at Western Sydney University and the Research Institute of Latin American Studies of the University of Alcalá. For this, I must thank my directors, Brett Bowden, Gregory Allen Barton, Eva Sanjara, and Pedro Pérez Herrero. I am particularly grateful to the latter, who was essential in the publication of the book. The same goes, obviously, for the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, whose Faculty of Liberal Arts gave me enormous support in the final stages of writing. So here we are. Without further ado, I would like to begin my remarks with an anecdote that I find very illuminating. The episode to which I refer appears in the memoirs of General William Miller. It was his brother, John Miller, who wrote and published them in 1828. As many will know, General Miller was one of the many Englishmen who, after participating in the Peninsular War against Napoleon, went to seek fame and fortune as officer in the troops fighting for the independence of the South American republics. His memoirs were between an adventurous story, a political essay, biography, and romantic historiography. The account described the amazing rise of Miller from a low officer in San Martin's army to a cavalry general in Bolivar's victorious troops. The text romanticized Miller's military exploits. It presented them as an effort to abolish the absolutist, monopolistic regime imposed by Spain in her dominions. The memoirs painted a picture of an outdated, despotic, anti-modern Hispanic world. It was easy for the reader to conclude that the British military who went to the wars of independence were libertarian heroes whose primary motivation had been to spread free trade, representative government, and civil liberty. The text's aims are pretty explicit. First, to vindicate Miller politically, to vindicate the figure of Miller as a libertarian hero. Second, to cultivate anti-Hispanic propaganda to justify the economic, diplomatic, and cultural influence the British were about to exert over the new Spanish-American states. The memoirs, however, convey a deeper, more problematic and difficult to identify historical concerns. These concerns were particularly evident in the passage describing the day Miller had seen the last Spanish viceroy with his own eyes. This scene had taken place on 9 December 1824, after the Battle of Ayacucho, which confirmed the end of Spanish monarchical rule in Peru and throughout the Americas. Let's read the passage where he explains or shows us the moment when Miller saw the last Spanish viceroy. I read the passage. Miller continued to be occupied on various duties till a very late hour. About midnight, he visited the captive viceroy, La Serna, who had been placed in one of the best habitations of the miserable camp of Quinoa. When Miller entered, he found the viceroy sitting on a bench and leaning against the mud wall of the hut. A glimmering from the wick of a small lamp threw enough of glare around to render visible his features, which were shaded by his white hair, still partially clothed with blood from the wound he had received. His person, tall and at all times dignified, now appeared most venerable and interesting. The attitude, the situation, and the scene altogether was precisely that which an historical painter would have chosen to represent the dignity of fallen greatness. Reflecting on the vicissitudes of fortune, it may be imagined with what feelings Miller advanced toward the man who, but a few hours previously, had exercised a kingly power. Well, as you will see, Miller described the viceroy as the spitting image of decadence. La Serna appeared to the reader as a personification of the accelerated and transformative time that had come with the Euro-American liberal revolutions of the 50 years preceding that moment. By claiming the value of this scene to serve as a monumental historical painting, Miller reveals how the fall of the Spanish Empire crystallized in the consciousness of Britain's romantic historicism as a fundamental milestone. The painting of the defeated viceroy summed up the sense of rupture and disorientation that societies in the Atlantic world were experiencing at the end of the ancient regime and the crisis of the imperial monarchies of the Atlantic world. Of course, the Miller brothers invented an optimistic solution for this historical problem, for this historical shame. According to them, the demise of the viceroyalties, while reminding us of the instability of political systems and the ephemeral existence of empires, would derive in an era of post-imperial prosperity, in which the new Spanish-American states would thrive thanks to free trade and the civilizing influence of Britain. His reading was not without controversy, however. To encounter a dissonant voice, we need only to explore the memoirs forward. Its author was José María Torrijos, a liberal general who had gone into exile in England after the defeat of Spanish constitutionalism in 1823. Torrijos lived in London thanks to an allowance from his former commander in the Peninsular War against Napoleon, the Duke of Wellington. To supplement his poor income, Torrijos turned to translation. The Millers, that were his friends, hired him to preface the memoirs and translate them. The Spanish edition appeared in 1829, the same as the second English edition. Both included Torrijos' prologue. The exciting thing is that Torrijos, far from limiting himself to translation, openly opposed Miller's thesis. In his view, the disintegration of the Spanish Empire was not the result of a popular struggle for political and commercial freedoms. The Spanish-American independencies resulted from a conspiracy of the Creole elite, who had tried to concentrate power in their hands and put a stop to the imperial reformism promoted by the Spanish Constitution of 1812, from La Pepa. The Republican independencies would not bring, according to him, prosperity, stability, and freedom, but anarchy, injustice, and chaos throughout the Spanish-speaking world. Miller's memoirs and Torrijos' foreword give us an account of the war of memories that raged in the immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American independencies and the centrality it had in public debate, both in Britain and Spain. It is no coincidence that Miller's writing and translations were a huge success with readers in the United Kingdom and in the Spanish monarchy. Its reviewers agreed that its resounding editorial triumph was due to the widespread interest of Spanish and British audiences in the consequences of the demise of the viceroyalties and the birth of the new republics, of the new Spanish-American republics. There were a lot of questions circulating in the public spheres of both countries. Would strong states emerge capable of guaranteeing legal order and free trade? Would the new republics be destroyed by infighting between competing interest groups and ethnicities? Was the proliferation of sovereign states a safe way to ensure the rule of law and free trade? Would the new republics be consumed by the reproduction of monopolies and corporative clienteles? Was the proliferation of ostensibly democratic constitutional states a threat to Spain and the United Kingdom? Or was it a blessing for them? Was the dismemberment of the Hispanic Empire a step in the direction of progress, of universal progress? Or was it a new slide into the abyss of civilizational chaos, as the Haitian and French revolutions had been, according to British and Spanish public opinions? On a more prosaic level, there was another very important question. Who was to blame for losing the empire? And more importantly, how to deal with the decomposition of the monarchy that had lost, half of the globe? How to relate to the new states? How to organize the new balances of power? How to face an uncertain future so different from what was previously known? The book explores how these questions circulated, as I told you, in the public spheres of Spain and the United Kingdom during the 3 decades following the Battle of Ayacucho. In other words, it analyzes the impact of the Spanish-American independencies on political thought in Spain and the United Kingdom during the transitional period that followed the Atlantic revolutions. In doing so, it seeks to dissect the exercises in mythologizing the Spanish monarchy's overseas past. It also attempts to understand how the political cultures of both spaces interpreted the republican developments that took place in Spanish America after 1824. The book explains how the ideologized memory of the imperial crisis became, for Spanish intellectuals, as well as for British and Irish intellectuals, a strategic sphere for the production of imperial knowledge, political myths, and geopolitical expectations. Such knowledge, myths, and expectations were not purely consensual. There was no single Spanish or British memory of the imperial crisis. Instead, we encounter a constellation of controversial interpretations which, on the shared substrata of romanticism, nationalism, and imperialism, responded to different ideological projects. Absolutists, moderados, progresistas, demo-republicans, socialists, Whigs, Tories, and radicals developed their own readings of Hispanic imperial disintegration. The book sheds light on the importance of Spanish-American emancipations in forging the political cultures of both monarchies during this time. The intellectual phenomenon in question occurred in an ideological context of transatlantic scale. To this end, I assumed the premise, already defended by authors such as Jocelyn Almeida, Stuart Andrews, even Jorge Cañizares Guerra, Pedro Pérez, that the most significant trends of 19th century thought operated in a framework of mental references based on a constant comparison of the historical experiences of the Americas and Europe. The same applies to the intellectual and ideological connections between the Anglo-Saxon and Hispanic worlds. As Graciela Iglesias Rogers and members of her research group have recently argued, it is necessary to stop considering relations between the English and Spanish-speaking societies in simplistic terms of otherness and competition. According to Iglesias Rogers, the 19th century saw the consolidation of a Hispanic-Anglosphere, that is, a circuit of economic, ecological, political, and intellectual interactions of global dimensions that are essential to explain the development of Western modernity. It is not desirable here to develop an exhaustive state-of-the-art. You can find it in the book or the doctoral thesis preceding it. I will simply say that the book fills three historiographical gaps. The first, it addresses a little studied period in the case of British Hispanism and also in the case of transatlantic imaginaries in Spain. It applies a comparative and transnational perspective that is very unusual in studies of 19th century imperial thought, especially regarding British and Spanish experiences. And also, well, the book pays close attention to the ideological differences of the various intellectual actors involved in the culture wars over the memory of the Spanish Empire. So my research has drawn on a very diverse set of primary sources consistent with the heuristic approaches of the new intellectual history, memory studies, and the study of political cultures. These sources include a variety of discursive typologies. First, I turn to books and pamphlets published by the leading thinkers of each political tendency. These include memoirs, autobiographies, historiographical works, essays, novels, and poetry collections. I also consulted the press of both countries, tracing the representations of the Spanish-American reality that appeared in the prominent newspapers and magazines of the time. And finally, I also examined the debates held in the House of Commons, the House of the Lords, and the Spanish Cortes during the period, obviously. All these testimonies have enabled me to reconstruct the wave of retrospection that followed Spanish American revolutions. Please allow me to explain the structure of the book briefly. This first part comprises two chapters. The first part comprises two chapters. The first chapter, Rise and Fall, deals with the representations of Spanish history that framed the debate on the decline of the imperial monarchy. The second chapter, Imperial Mirrors, dissects the ideological evaluations of the Spanish system of imperial governance that proliferated among the thinkers I address. It demonstrates how these interpretations legitimized and guided 19th century imperialist projects in both the UK and Spain. All of them, the book's second part, Memory and Revolution, comprises 3 chapters. All of them have as their object the wars of memory surrounding the causes and consequences of the Spanish-American independencies, emancipations. The first chapter focuses on a group of thinkers with counter-revolutionary and Tory tendencies. The second does the same with the mnemonic discourses produced by Whiggism, radicalism, and Spanish republicanism that were very similar. The last section investigates the thoughts of Spanish liberals, whether progresistas, radical liberals, or moderados, conservative liberals. It is a very long, very heavy, and very complex work, typical of a novice writer. I do not want to overwhelm you with all the information in each chapter, so I will illustrate the ideas of some of the intellectuals and groups I have analyzed in them, focusing my attention mainly on the first chapter. As I have said, this one explores the master narratives that the Spanish and British employed to explain Spain's geopolitical decline. The section demonstrates that each intellectual actor tended to identify convenient causes for legitimizing his own personal role in the imperial crisis and defending the political program of the power group to which he or she belonged. Let's analyze Agustín de Argüelles, the leader of progressive liberalism of the Partido Progresista in Spain. Argüelles had been one of the leading promoters of the Cortes of Cádiz in 1810. In that context, he advocated summoning the deputies from the American provinces to the imperial parliament. However, he had never accepted that the Spaniards of the Americas should enjoy a representation proportional to that of the European representatives. After the imperial collapse and the failure of transatlantic constitutionalism, transatlantic Spanish constitutionalism, Argüelles went into exile in London, where his close friend Lord Holland welcomed him. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, the liberals regained the state control. However, the monarchy was in the middle of a conflict. The Carlists launched a war to uphold the absolutist model, and the constitutionalists were divided between moderates and progresistas. In this context, each side tried to blame its ideological rivals for Spain's decline and for the loss of the Spanish colonies in continental America. Argüelles, who returned to Spain to lead the progressives, needed to justify his role in the imperial crisis and defend his party's national project. This situation led Argüelles to publish a text that combined autobiographical memoir and Spanish historiography. Its title was Examen Histórico de la Reforma Constitucional, an historical exam of the constitutional reform in Spain. Argüelles alleged that the decline of the monarchy began with the annulment of the medieval parliamentary liberties of the Spanish peoples. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, the Habsburgs and Bourbons crushed municipal autonomy and representative government, creating a status theocracy that ruled in the interest of the elites enslaving the people. In Argüelles' view, from his point of view, the convening of a constitutional parliament in 1810 had not meant a revolutionary break with the loss of the monarchy, but a recovery of its historical traditions. This historicist myth of birth, death, and resurrection gave notable prominence to Spanish America. According to Argüelles, the first conquistadors had transplanted the proto-democratic political culture of Spanish Middle Ages overseas. In the Indies, the best municipal liberties and civil laws consubstantial to the Hispanic race had survived. Moreover, Argüelles theorized that the yoke of absolutism had been less tight on the Americas than on the peninsula itself. Argüelles stated that the convening of the Cortes of Cádiz had meant a restoration of the historical liberties of Spaniards in the two hemispheres. His text suggested that the transatlantic scale parliamentary monarchy postulated by the Constitution of 1812 by La Pepa had meant the end of Hispanic decadence. Spanish liberal deputies, among whom he figured prominently, appeared as legislative heroes. However, Argüelles claimed that the Spanish absolutists and the Spanish American revolutionaries had been too blind to act in the national interest. Guided by self-interest, they had caused the constitutional experiment of Cádiz to fail, breaking the unity of the Hispanic world and showing reaction and anarchy. Adopting this discursive strategy, Argüelles blamed his political rivals for the loss of the empire while vindicating the legacy of radical liberalism, of Spanish radical liberalism. The chapter explains how the intellectuals and the press of the Partido Progresista, the Progressive Party, reproduced this narrative during the 1830s. Also, the blaming of absolutism for the imperial laws even appeared in the poetry published by some leaders of radical liberalism. If you want, later we can talk about that. The chapter also demonstrates that Argüelles' work was the fruit of a fluid relationship with British Romantic historiography. Historians and essayists such as Maria Calcott, Mary Margaret Basque, and Harriet Martineau partially seconded the Spanish politician in his diagnosis. According to their respective accounts of the Iberian past, the Catholic Church and foreign dynasties had disrupted the organic development of representative institutions in Spain and its colonies. Indeed, the English works concluded that imperial expansion had helped to enrich the clergy and royalty, weakening the power of the Hispanic peoples and mostly of the Hispanic parliaments. Unlike Argüelles, however, the weak intelligentsia did not interpret the Cortes of Cádiz as a break with royal tyranny. On the contrary, British writers emphasize how the Spanish deputies had sought to obstruct any reform aimed at the commercial liberalization of the empire. The granting of representation to Spanish Americans had been the fruit of the need to preserve overseas tribute, but the Spanish liberals had always wished to maintain the colonial yoke. In this view, Spanish American societies could not aspire to political and economic modernity if they remained under the domination of a Spain who was doomed to prohibitionism, corruption, and bigotry. This negative mythologization of the Hispanic past also found expression in poetry and painting. For example, the image of Columbus being arrested and chained by the Catholic monarchs, for example, became a symbol of how Hispanic political tradition had become destructive to the progress of civilization. Of course, such a narrative justified the revolutions of independence, the opening of Spanish American markets, and the economic and cultural hegemony of the United Kingdom. Such a plot was not exclusive to British thinkers. Some liminal figures, such as the Andalusian writer José María Blanco White, would become its main disseminators. Blanco White was also interested in justifying his own personal role in the disintegration of the monarchy, and would also publish several autobiographical texts between the 1820 and the 1850. In this, he justified his role as the head of several newspapers that had promoted Spanish American independencies. In any case, illiberal narratives combated weak interpretative positions in Spain and the UK. As we only have a little time left, I will focus on one very significant figure, William Walton. Walton was the son of the Spanish consul in Liverpool and had great knowledge of peninsular politics. He was also a staunch advocate of counter-revolutionary measures in America, Europe, and also the British Isles. In his treatises on Spain, he claimed that Spain's imperial decline was not due to absolutism. On the contrary, in his view, the old regime traditions had enabled the monarchy to rule its vast territories fairly and effectively. Walton blamed the deterioration of the political system on the weakening of the crown in the 17th century. In his opinion, it had led to the sale of municipal offices and the spread of corruption. But the problem was not the power of the crown, but the weakening of the crown. His work argued that the Spanish constitutionalist attempt to reorganize the empire based on a representative system had meant the final decline of the monarchy. The break with the imperial political system had given way to anarchy and civil conflict, plunging the Hispanic world into geopolitical and economic ruin. In an imitation of Burke, Walton argued that Spain's proper imperial regeneration would have involved gradually reforming its monarchical institutions. Throughout the book, I study another liminal figures, for example, who defended similar arguments to Walton's, for example, George Dawson Flinter. Flinter had fought under Wellington in the War of Spain, in the war against Napoleon in the Peninsula. He then went to fight against France in the Caribbean, where he married a wealthy Cuban landowner. This situation led him to serve Venezuela's royalist armies and later settle in Spain. The Irishman would publish a series of treatises in English and Spanish in which he advocated the need for the United Kingdom to form an anti-republican front alongside the Spanish monarchy. Their goal must be to end the political revolutions that were triumphing in the Americas and infecting Europe. Flinter's interpretation of the Spanish decline was a global one. He argued that the chimeras of republicanism and revolutionary contractualism were undermining the foundations of gradual progress that absolute monarchies had guaranteed throughout the previous century. Spain's liberal thinkers, such as the Marquis of Valle Santoro, Manuel Amado, Mariano Torrente, shared this interpretation. Well, I'm ending the presentation. Let me see, here it is. The important thing I want to underline is that the examples I have just shared give an idea of the kind of debates explored throughout the book. Please ask about the content of the rest of the chapters later on. What is important is that, in line with the above, the research has led to some interesting comparative conclusions. First, given the scale of the discussions I have analyzed, the Spanish-American independencies had a very relevant impact on public debate in Spain and the United Kingdom. Intellectual actors in both monarchies felt the need to historicize them to confront the uncertain future that followed the collapse of the Spanish imperial system. This process took place in a transnational argumentative context. It implied a fluid intertextual relationship between Spanish and British authors, who also engaged in dialogue with intellectual actors in Spanish America, continental Europe, and the United States, obviously. The struggles of memory that ensued after the collapse of the Spanish Empire did not follow national lines. Its political culture within Spain and the United Kingdom cultivated its own myths of Hispanic decline. In any case, interpretations of Spanish America's past and present had a vital political component. Their cultivators instrumentalized them for legitimation, identification, and planning for future geopolitical action. We can elaborate on all this in the dialogue with James and other participants. So thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. If Jamie could follow now with his discussion of the book and the talk of Rodrigo.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to begin by thanking the Modern History Research Center, Graciela Iglesias Rogers, and the University of Winchester for organizing this event. And thanks to Rodrigo for introducing his book so well. I'll be brief in my comments so we can get to our conversation. So Rodrigo Escribano Roca's wonderful new book, Memorias del viejo imperio, it's a really impressive achievement in both intellectual history and the history of political culture. In my comments today, I want to focus on three of the book's major contributions. First, Escribano's reconstruction of not just the world of intellectuals, but an entire political culture. Second, his success in reorienting Atlantic history. And third, his ability to link political culture to political and social change. So to begin, at first glance, this book appears to be intellectual history, and it is a quite good intellectual history of numerous authors grappling with the meanings and significance of the loss of Spain's overseas empire and the new republics that emerged. However, it is so much more than that. The immense quantity and variety of primary sources Rodrigo has utilized for this study are impressive. He exploited intellectual treatises, pamphlets, memoirs, essays, novels, plays, biographies, autobiographies, histories, travel narratives, government reports, English parliamentary records, debates in the Spanish Cortes, popular magazines and newspapers, written by soldiers, politicians, historians, travelers, diplomats, and merchants. And Escribano absorbed all of this material so that he could capture the entire political culture of a moment, not just the thoughts of a few great thinkers. Rodrigo is exploring not just an historical problem, which he does do quite well, but he also captures an entire historical milieu or mentalite. This is a fine intellectual history, but it's also the history of a broader political culture. Second, the book pushes forward the very necessary project of reconceptualizing the Atlantic world. When I read books about Atlantic history, at least in the U.S. Academy, that come out of the U.S. Academy, I'm so often struck by how the actors in this Atlantic world basically speak English, with a smattering of French, perhaps. Escribano's Atlantic history is not centered on, but also not separate from, the Anglophone world. He has uncovered a truly Atlantic dialogue, both in the sense of his historical actors and thinkers operating in the context of an Atlantic world, but also actually moving throughout that world and sharing influences across that world. Escribano is looking not just at discourses in England and Spain, which alone would be a Herculean task, but at transatlantic networks, especially in the Americas, that influence these discourses. Therefore, the book is part of a broader rethinking of the Atlantic world. In most older works on Atlantic history, causality always flowed west from the UK and France, first to influence Spain and then on to Latin America. Influence and agency were almost always unidirectional, from the imagined center to the periphery. However, Escribano shows how tightly connected the intellectual worlds of Spain and the United Kingdom were. More impressive, and of course of great interest to myself as a scholar of Latin America, is how Escribano uncovers a circuit of international intellectual exchange. Just for one example, between British Whigs, Spanish American Republicans, and Spanish Democrats, when discussing the perceived legacies of colonialism. And even while this book is about the Spanish and British public spheres, Escribano also notes when influence flowed east from the New World to the Old. Although less, realized today in the 19th century, there was the broad assumption that American republics would serve as an example for and influence on European politics. Escribano carefully explores how some writers saw this as nefarious, just as he talked about in his talk opening up, with the Irish soldier George Dawson Flinter, who feared that Latin American democracy would spread to Europe, a contagion that would challenge aristocracies and property rights. However, the Anglo-Spanish writer Jose Maria Blanco White and others argue that Spain would be rejuvenated into a democratic republic by the influence of the new American societies. In Escribano's book and in the reality of the 19th century, intellectual and social influence was multi-directional across the Atlantic. Third, Rodrigo shows how these were not just sterile academic debates, but conversations that had powerful social, political, and economic effects. The debates about the meanings of the loss of Spain's American colonies and the creation of New World republics powerfully affected the political cultures of both countries. This was not only an academic debate, but one taking place across the public sphere, and one as concerned not so much with understanding the past alone, but with using the past to understand the present and shape the future. This concern with the future means that Escribano's book also contributes to a growing literature on understanding modernity, as historical actors understood it, instead of imposing a definition from today. But beyond that, Escribano shows the effects of these understandings of modernity and how they were marshaled to promote political programs. And as Rodrigo showed in his talk, there was not just one political program or even one English and Spanish one, but this was a multivocal debate, a kaleidoscope of different opinions and readings reflecting different ideological lenses. His books captures these debates so well. The great strength of the book is the number of intellectual currents Rodrigo follows. The liberal or English Whig faction, the anti-liberal Tory English, the Republican and liberal Spanish, the progressive Spanish, the moderate Spanish, the anti-liberal or absolutist Spanish, and the Cuban and other colonial reformers factions. These groups did not just create different interpretations of the past for different political ends, but the interpretations themselves served to strengthen these political blocs' self-identifications. And Escribano details how these discourses had important effects. For example, the debate if the Constitution of 1812 had caused independence and over if Spanish colonialism was particularly beneficial or not massively influenced debates over the Constitution of 1837 and the designation of Spain's remaining overseas territories as colonias. And again, that word sort of appearing for the first time and used that way, and excluding them from parliamentary representation. Spanish anti-liberals' insistence that Spanish colonialism was a civilizing presence enjoyed by the Americas, in another example, shaped the absolutist press to insist Mexicans would welcome the 1838 invasion at Tampico. Equally powerful, Escribano argues that the Spanish-American case study became an imperial laboratory, a fascinating counterpoint to my own argument that it was also a laboratory for democracy, where Britain especially experimented with new forms of commercial penetration and diplomatic influence. In conclusion, the book succeeds in showing how history was used to define the present and in efforts to predict and shape the future. My only substantive critique of the book is one I, as an historian of popular political culture, make of all intellectual history. As I've said, I was impressed by Escribano's ability to capture the details and nuances of the different strands of political discourse in both the United Kingdom and Spain. However, I wonder what everyday people, say a factory worker in Manchester or a dock worker in Cadiz, thought about these issues. What I'm sure about is that they did have some thoughts on them. Whom did they support? Did they have their own conceptions about empire? Of course, this was not Escribano's project, and the book is quite long already. But I would love to hear his thoughts, and I do hope other scholars follow his lead to investigate how popular groups perceive the loss of empire and the new American republics. While that is my only critique, the book raises so many fascinating questions. One deals with race. In spite of the various political factions' contradictory and conflicted visions on almost every possible interpretation of Spain's empire and the independent American republics, one interpretation almost all agreed on, save for the most fervent Democrats, was that the America's racial heterogeneity was a problem. Escribano shows how writers of different political orientations and distinct historiographic interpretations of independence and the perceived failure of post-colonial nations all blame the America's non-European racially diverse societies. Rodrigo, could you talk a little bit about any differences you saw and how Spanish and English writers conceptualized the possibilities of indigenous peoples compared to Afro-Latin Americans for potential citizenship, inclusion, or exclusion? What also struck me about the interpretive debates you were studying is how contemporary they feel. We're still fighting these same historiographic battles today about the nature of colonies and colonialism, questioning whether Spain's overseas empire really was colonial at all, debating the 19th century as a story of Spanish colonial legacies or as one of Republican failure, and questioning the importance and nature of the Constitution of 1812. We also see the origins of so many schools of thought about the 19th century in these writers, such as the emphasis on caudillos and anarchy that defined much of the 19th century historiography up to the 1970s. What do you think your early 19th century thinkers and writers can tell us about today's current historiographical debates and battles? And finally, I would also like to know a little more about your own intellectual journey in creating this book. Memorias del viejo imperio is about how historians and other writers told histories and created myths to justify their own political ends. What do you think a future historian studying the works of one Rodrigo Escribano Roca would argue were the myths that organized your own writing? How are you engaged in a public debate in the year 2022? I think this book tells us so much about the past, but it also tells us something about our own present. What does this work say about that present? And what were your preoccupations in writing it? Thank you. Oops.
You had to unmute yourself, Rodrigo.
Sorry. Thank you very much, James. Graciela, do you want me to answer the questions now?
Yes, please. I
Okay,
will say answer first James' questions, and then we open to the public.
Okay, perfect. So, okay, thank you very much, James. There are very interesting and difficult questions. The first one about the indigenous peoples. Well, I mean, in this respect, the first thing I must underline is that I have not seen a substantial difference between Spanish and English thinkers. This conclusion would not please a particular tendency within conservative historiography in Spain, which has insisted in the inclusive character of Spanish colonial thought, but I have not seen substantive difference in the positions about indigenous peoples in Spanish thought and British thought. The differences I have noticed have more to do with the ideological tendencies of each thinker. The Spanish Republicans or English radicals, for example, were very strict in considering the indigenous peoples as anti-modern subjects who were subjugated to the church and corporate culture. So these thinkers, such, for example, Méndez de Vigo or the British traveler, the Robinsons, thought the indigenous people should either be excluded from political citizenship or eliminated from the social body, either through assimilation or eugenics. Conservative tendencies in both countries shared this interpretative framework also. However, they used it to argue for the need to establish monarchical, authoritarian, and centralized governments overseas. For example, Robert Montgomery Martin used this theory to justify a policy of centralization in the British Empire, an anti-democratic imperial political community. In contrast, for example, Spanish conservatives, Martínez de la Rosa and Luis Manuel Rivero, would use this image of the indigenous and African people to legitimize their attempt to remonarchize Mexico, for example, or defend the continuity of legal exceptionality, a legal exceptionality regime in the Philippines and the Caribbean. So, for example, institutions as slavery could continue existing. So the only apparent exception I have found in the thought of is the thought of Gertrudis Gómez de Avellaneda, the Spanish-Cuban writer who in her novels vindicates the agency of indigenous and Afro-descendant subjects and also of women. It's very interesting. The novel Sap and the novel Guatimozin, I recommend it to the assistants. Certainly, she also does it in a Eurocentric way. She considers that the emancipation of subjugated peoples depends on their spontaneous assumption of Christian values and also romantic values. So in short, Spanish and English thinkers do not differ significantly in their characterizations of Afro-descendant and indigenous people. What changes are the solutions they imagine to overcome their imagined racial inferiority. So the radical sectors propose their assimilation into a republican and civic order. The conservatives propose their tutelage and segregation through a monarchist and illiberal political order. That's the difference, probably. Your second question, also very interesting, also difficult. I think you are right. I was also surprised that the debates held in the second third of the 19th century were similar to those that still occupy us, contemporary historians. One example, I can put one example. As many will know, since the 90s, a historiographical tendency led by François Xavier Guerra, Chema Portillo, Javier Fernández Sebastián, Pedro Pérez, has argued that the Latin American revolutions of independence did not initially use the language of liberal contractualism. They would have resorted to, on the contrary, to the scholastic theory of municipal sovereignty. That is to say, these actors resort to the legitimacies of ancient regime to emancipate themselves from the crown. Well, my book shows that this thesis is nothing new, and that authors such as Argüelles, Urquinaona, Walton, and even Carlyle defended it in my study period. I believe that these continuities have several explanations. First, it is true that an objective historical reality can give rise to these interpretations, although they only reflect a minimal dimension of that reality. On the other hand, I think that this continuity refers to the strength of the schools of thought established within national historiographies. In Spain, it is very easy, and I think we should do it, to reconstruct the disciplinary genealogy that connects the authors I study with the Hispano-Americanist historiography of the 20th and 21st centuries. Arguelles is the master of, is very important in the thought of Garrido. Garrido is very important in the thought of Rafael María de Labra. Rafael María de Labra is very important in the thought of Rafael Altamira. Rafael Altamira is very important in the thought of Silvio Zavala. Silvio Zavala is very important in the thought of Pedro Pérez Herrero, 21st century historian with Arguelles. We have a genealogy. Pedro Pérez did not know this because there is not this memory that this interpretation goes back to the 19th century, but it's very easy to reconstruct this. So this is to say, I would venture to hypothesize that we have been trapped in a sort of tautology. The first politicized readings of the independencies have been transmitted generation through generation, acquiring a veneer of scientificity. In this case, emphasizing that the Latin American independencies resulted from Hispanic municipalism has been very convenient for a historiography attached to Spanish progressive nationalism and to Spanish democracy. So I believe that this is precisely the most important reason for the interpretative continuities, that the political problems derived from the Atlantic revolutions are still relevant even in the 21st century. It's a present past, as David Lowenthal would say. Therefore, their historical explanation necessarily continues to have a political content. Another very clear case is the one you mentioned about Republican anarchy. In the book, I show that this reading of the processes of state building in Latin America has become very popular in Spanish counter-revolutionary thought of the period. Spanish anti-republicanism sought to justify the continuity of the monarchy in Spain and interventionism in America. And interestingly, this negative image of Latin American political chaos continues to appear recurrently today in the discourse of the Spanish radical right, which every time it wants to attack its internal political rivals compares them to Chavismo, Venezuela, disorder, communism, Latin America. Some historians also support this political discourse, such as Marcial Pons Roca, for example. So I think the continuities have to do with the strength of certain disciplinary structures that have conditioned national historiographies, but they are also related to the survival of the political problems derived from the independencies. That's my answer. And for your final question, sorry if I'm being too heavy and too long with my answers, but on the one hand, you asked me about my own experience writing the book. Well, on the one hand, I mean, once again, my interest in this topic stemmed from my first trip to Chile in 2012. I was an undergraduate student in my third year, and Santander Bank gave me a scholarship to study for 6 months in Latin America. And at first I applied to go to Santiago de Cuba, but the people in charge of the bank told me, no, that is a communist country. So they sent me randomly to Santiago de Chile. And when I started my trip, well, my knowledge of the region was heavily influenced by the myths circulating in the Hispanic public sphere today. On the one hand, I imagine Latin America like a romantic land full of guerrillas, indigenous people, and revolutionaries fighting against capitalism and imperialism. On the other hand, I also projected the simplistic image of a continent rife with drug trafficking and crime. When I arrived in Santiago de Chile, this prejudice vanished and my view of the world changed, I think that forever. I found a very complex society, which was very similar to Spain and at the same time very different. The language and the way of relating to each other were similar, but there were also enormous differences that fascinated me, obviously. I also got the impression that both had shared problems with the unresolved legacies of their dictatorships, for example, and also specific structural features of their political cultures. So as the months went by and I was living in Chile during that year, I decided to devote part of my life to understanding the genealogy of the historical problems that connect Spain and Latin America's passage through what we call modernity. But for that, I had to historicize my own doubt. And so I came to the original question of the book. How did European Spaniards experience the dissolution of the empire and the birth of the Latin American republics? As my other trips had been to England and the United States, I immediately asked myself, how did this same process affect the consciousness of the Anglo-Saxon world? So the conclusion for your question is simple. This book was born because I was fascinated by Chile and the questions about my own identity that it raised. Ultimately, I am not better or worse than the authors I analyze in the book. My historiographical reflections result from my concern for the present and the future, and this book is the work of a millennial concerned about the crisis of representative democracy in Spain, in Chile, in the Atlantic world. A millennial who sought answers to that concern in the intellectual universe that emerged after the birth of the modern Euro-American states. So that's the answer.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Fantastic.
Long,
could I
sorry.
ask people to ask questions with the reactions area? I mean, raise your hand. Do we have any raised hand at the moment? I can ask a question in that case. Oh, no, we have one. We have one. We have Christine Hannefeld-Fraude. If you could unmute yourself and just put your question.
Graciela, I have a question. If someone feels a little bit better, could he or she make the question in Spanish? And I can answer it in English?
Absolutely. Yes.
Hispanic
I should have said that. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes.
No,
yes.
Don't worry.
Yes. We are bilingual here. No problem. Yes. Go ahead. I mean.
Christine, yeah?
Yes.
Gracias, Graciela. Muchas gracias, querido escribano. Yo quiero retroceder un poco en el tiempo. Yo cuando pienso en la independencia, pienso en la fractura del espacio en América Latina. Y eso me lleva a pensar en la consolidación de las audiencias en el siglo XVI. ¿Tú crees que es casualidad, dado los pensamientos que manejas, que las audiencias básicamente se conviertan más adelante en los países independientes? Y eso me lleva un poco a pensar también en el rol, no solamente filosófico, ideológico de las élites regionales, sino también los intereses económicos y su relación, lo que presentaba James también, ¿no? De las poblaciones indígenas y negras. Y la otra consideración que me gustaría proponer es las únicas audiencias que no fueron países más adelante fueron Guadalajara y Cusco, ¿no? Y si tú miras el mapa de la nueva construcción de los Estados-nación, te vas a dar cuenta que los países, las nuevas fronteras, se forjan dividiendo las poblaciones indígenas. Eso es cierto para Colombia, es cierto para México, es cierto para Centroamérica, es cierto sobre todo por los Andes, ¿no? Incluyendo a Chile, con grupos aymaras de ambos lados, ¿no? Después de la conciliación de los Estados-nación. Entonces mi pregunta es un poco la prolongación de la pregunta de James, ¿no? Es decir, ¿hasta qué punto las ideas pudieron efectivamente influir las luchas por la independencia y sus consecuencias? Y hasta qué punto hay una racionalidad mucho más económica, ideológica, local, que efectivamente consolida el proyecto de la independencia. No sé si eso te merece algunas reflexiones, pero muchas gracias. Es un
A lot of them, Christine. Here we are dealing with two manifestations of the past. We have the past as representation. That is what I have mostly studied along the book. But we have also the past as a real continuity, as a structural continuity that that is present in the contemporaneity of Spain and the Latin American republics. And what I try to explain in the book is that the Americas are so important in the political thought of the United Kingdom and Spain because the transformations that have happened after the revolutions haven't completely destroyed the past. The past is present, and all the legacies from the Spanish monarchy and the Catholic monarchy are not resolved. So the interpretative exercises, the historical discourses that are constructed by Spanish intellectuals, British intellectuals, but also Latin American intellectuals after the emancipations are projects for forging the new sovereignties that are emerging in this political laboratory that is Latin America. And obviously, I think it's so obvious that the new states in the region use the colonial administrative structures to legitimize their own sovereignty over the space. That, as you say, well, the audiences correspond to the actual territory of the countries where we are, well, the republics of the continent. Also, when I remember when I was in San Diego talking with you, you told me, Rodrigo, you gave me a lesson of Marxist historiography, and you told me, Rodrigo, follow the money, follow the capital. And I realized that in the writing of the book, we didn't tell this, but that most of the discourses that promoted a pan-Hispanic reconciliation in Spain, that promoted a mythologized version of imperial history, were partially promoted by the boards of trade of the peninsula, because the boards of trade were interested in reestablishing trade with the new republics. And to establish trade with the new republics, they needed that they had a good impression, a good image of the long history of the Spanish Empire. So here the interesting thing is that colonial interests after the emancipations continue existing, and that the historical discourses that emerged during this time, during this post-imperial time, are instruments, are weapons to control the transformations that are taking place in Latin America, in Spain, and also in the British Empire. So, bueno, pues como te digo, ¿no? Por ponernos bilingües, básicamente me convence totalmente lo que dices. Esas continuidades existen. Y por supuesto, obviously, the racial discourses are also a political necessity for, in the case of Latin American republics, for excluding or dealing with the political power of indigenous peoples. And also, we cannot forget that Spain is still an empire that has 3 important colonies where there exists slavery and indigenous labor. So they still need to legitimize the empire, the old empire in the Americas, in order to legitimize the political colonial order in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, and in Filipinas. So obviously, the historical structures of imperial past are a central issue in the configuration of the political and historical imaginaries of Spain and the United Kingdom during this juncture, this period I study. So yeah, very good question. I don't know if I have answered correctly, but that's my answer.
Perfect, Rodrigo. We have first Roberto Perez, and then we have Jorge Cañizares Guerra. Okay. So first, Roberto, please.
Hi, I don't know whether or not to ask the questions in Spanish or English.
If we have a choice, I will
Lo que
suggest
prefieras,
English, but
whatever you prefer.
yes.
Excuse me?
If there is a choice, go for English, because I think most people speak
Roberto?
English here.
Well,
yeah.
Yes, I was just.
I cannot hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Hello?
I can hear him.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear Roberto, Graciela?
I can. Yeah.
Yes.
Me too.
Oh,
Hello?
okay. Well,
I can. Can you hear me,
¿Alguien me
Rodrigo?
oye?
Rodrigo,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? I cannot
Yes.
hear you. I don't know why. It's me?
Yes.
Oh my God. Wait a minute. I don't know what has happened. Let me see. I cannot hear you. Let me do something. Let me.
He's going to be back. I'm sure what he's trying to do is to log in and log back again. So let's wait a moment.
Yeah, I can hear him too, Graciela. It's
Yes.
fine.
Yes. I don't think. I think it's his audio. Something happened with Rodrigo's audio. But I think he's going to come back in a moment.
I'm sure.
I took my headphones out.
Yes.
So sorry. I thought it could have been my problem.
No, it was not your problem, Roberto. It was not your problem at all. For some reason, his audio started to fall because he could hear me initially, and then he couldn't hear me either. So. Right.
Graciela?
Yes.
Sorry, is the chat working for questions?
It should be working. I mean, my chat is there. I sent him a message saying hello or welcome, and it should be working.
Okay.
No, it says it's only available for the team members.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. I'll see if I can do something about it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Why is doing that? Okay. Options. Reactions. There's nothing in the meeting options that is stopping the chat working, so I don't understand.
Maybe it's in security options, Graciela?
No, it's not appearing anything. I worry about Rodrigo.
Yeah.
Frankly, the bit of the chat, I'm not so concerned. I'm more concerned about Rodrigo not showing us again.
Sorry, he says that he's trying to reconnect his computer because he went off. So
okay,
he's coming back.
Okay, good. That's reassuring. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Okay. In the meantime, I'll keep on trying with the chat. Why is not working the chat?
So Rodrigo is coming to my bureau and to connect because his computer is not working at all. So he's coming in a few minutes or few seconds. He's coming right down. So,
We'll wait, especially when there are two questions there to be answered. So we'll certainly wait. There we are.
So sorry.
Hello, back again. Excellent.
My computer has just I don't know, imploded. Sorry, so sorry. So Roberto, you were asking.
Yeah, the first thing is I totally connect with the stereotype of South Americans in Europe, because I remember when I was in high school in London, and we had Mufti Day or Casual Friday. They said, okay, you can come with your whatever you guys wear in Chile on Casual Friday. I remember. And but my question is regarding the lessons from the Spanish American culture that perhaps English people took in order to better promote British interests in Latin America, and two, not to make perhaps the same mistakes or take those lessons in the relationship with the rest of the British Empire or future Commonwealth.
It's a very interesting question, Roberto. Is the most important issue I deal with during my chapter Imperial Mirrors, because I have discovered that a lot of British authors use the lessons, the historical lessons that derive from their interpretations of the fall of the Spanish Empire to imagine how the imperial policy of Britain in India or in the dominions should be. For example, there is an institution, the Hakluyt Society, that is fully dedicated to the translation to English of the chronicles and the most important documents of Spanish imperial history. And the Hakluyt Society use that text or put that text in disposition of a lot of parliamentarians, deputies, and intellectuals that use them for their argumentations, for example, in the House of Commons. For example, we have Robert Montgomery Martin defending the necessity of centralizing the administration of India because it would be a replication of the model of New Spain that have functioned for 3 centuries effectively. Or we have some radical deputies during the 40s defending that it was necessary to give an autonomous parliament to Canada, and using as an example the Cortes of Cádiz for not recommending the possibility of creating an imperial parliament. So the lessons of Spanish imperialism were very important in the configuration of British imperial imagination and ideologies during the 19th century. In the second chapter, I deal with it, and if you are interested, I could send you the second chapter in a PDF or something like that, or you can buy the book if you want. So.
Certainly. On the other hand, regarding using the culture they were learning about Latin America to promote Britain and British interests in Latin America, especially after opening up the commerce in the region.
Obviously, you are meaning obviously they use their historical accounts about Spanish tyranny, yeah, as I told during the presentation, to justify the commercial penetration. What I also explained in the 5th chapter is that at the first moment, British public opinion believes that the penetration in Latin American markets is going to be very easy, because they construct this idea that there is South America is too rich, and the only reason why South America has not progressed during the 17th and 18th centuries is the monopolistic system of the Spanish Empire. So they are very optimistic. And when British merchants, British traders, and British banks invest in Latin American republics during the 1820s, they discover that things are more complicated, that the Republican spaces are too big, that there is a lot of political turmoil, that there are a lot of corporations that are not interested in opening their markets easily. So the decades from the 1820s to the 1840s are ones of a kind of learning, a kind of accumulation of imperial knowledge about Latin America in British public mind. And what I see is that travelers and the military that have participated in the wars of independence begin to inform British press and the British political elite that things in Latin America are not going to be the same as in the United States, and that the commercial prosperity and political stability that the United States enjoyed after in their post-imperial history is not going to be easily replicated in the case of the Hispanic world. And I think that this process of accumulation of information is essential for the efficiency that British informal imperialism is going to have from the second half of the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, because from the 50s, British agents know much better the region, know much better the fragmentation of the markets, know much better the diversity of the societies, know much better the way of negotiating with the Republican political elites. So that is also a very interesting issue. Sorry. Todos los problemas que puedan pasar, pasarán. Sorry.
But all will be overcome, don't
Yeah,
worry.
yeah.
We have a question from Jorge Cañizares Esguerra. Jorge, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation, and I look forward to reading the book. I have 3 interconnected questions. I don't know whether you can answer all of them at once or take them separately, but your model of historiography, British and Spanish, that is persisted from the 19th century to today, these interpretations of independence and republicanism as either failed states or decentralized caudillos, violence, whatever. Do they? And you say that these models of cabildo autonomy are still persistent in the Hispanic historiography of today, of the post-Cadiz, or and you also insist that these models of the monarchists rethinking the aftermath of independence are still persistent today in particularly gringo interpretations of 19th century republicanism. Is there any counterpart to Hilda Sabatos' interpretation that is far more positive today, or Jamie Sanders' interpretation of 19th century republicanism as vanguards of democracy, or as experiments on democracy that are at the forefront of republicanism and modernity? Is there a third interpretation in the 19th century that could correspond to Jamie's models or Hilda Sabatos' models? One question. And the other question is, the the one on miscegenation. One thing that separated in the colonial period British or England from the Spanish Empire is notions of political subjecthood. In the case of Spanish Empire, subjecthood is associated to belonging to a Catholicism. So blacks and Indians are subjects. So belonging or subjecthood is not related necessarily to race, even though there are categories, racial categories, etc. But it's not attached to race. But the British or the English conceive subjecthood differently, and it's along racial lines. So, for instance, in Jamaica, when they take over, blacks are considered to be other republic, namely, or other polity, namely Maroons, and they are considered to this day to be independent polities within the polity. So there is a line separating subjecthood that goes along race. Natives and blacks are not subjects. If they are free, they can be slaves, but not subjects. And that led to an understanding of Spanish Empire as degenerate, as characterized by degenerate mixing of races. All throughout the colonial period, it's a constant. And the Spaniards, or whatever, the Spanish polity, the imperial polity, not only Spaniards, but Creoles and everyone else, but he understood miscegenation to be something positive. It seems like by the 19th century that is changing, that this divide, this historical divide that separated Spain from, or Spanish historiography from English Anglo historiography is changing, and miscegenation now is becoming something negative. Although in 19th century Latin America, at least in the first half, wasn't something negative, and it was considered to be a plus, a strength, or democratic strength, as it were, but in certain sectors, not in all sectors. So what is changing is the historiographic change. I mean, what seems to be changing, and is anybody in this framework of interpretations that you have, these massive variety of interpretations that are emerging, is anybody defending miscegenation as a positive thing? And what are Latin Americans themselves doing with these interpretations? Are they just following these British, Spanish liberal monarchies interpretations, or they are developing an alternative voice, a third voice that is neither Spanish nor British?
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful questions. I'm sorry we are a little bit out of time, but I will try to answer them satisfactorily. About the first question, if there is a third way, a third interpretative way. Yes, there is. For example, when I studied Spanish Republican thought, Méndez de Vigo and also Fernando Garrido consider that Latin America could be a school of democracy for Spain. And I have only studied these two authors that believe that Latin America was a step further than Spain in the way for a republican democratic future. So they think that when republican order consolidated in Latin America, they thought that for the consolidation of republican order, there had to be a second revolution where the Catholic Church and the landowner interest would be destroyed, and where the people would finally be the main actor in sovereignty. But they thought that when that second revolution happened in Latin America, it would infect Spain, and it would give Spanish republicanism a model to follow in order to create the first Spanish Republic. And as I told you, I have only studied two authors that are very important in this tendency of thought, Fernando Garrido and Méndez de Vigo. But there are no studies yet in Spanish historiography about the importance that the image of Latin American revolutionaries and the image of Latin American democracies had in the consolidation and the configuration of the political culture of Spanish republicanism. I think they are very important. For example, I have found, it's not included in the book, that in the ceremonies for the, well, in some celebrations of the Democratic Party in Spain during the 1860s, they would have images, for example, of Benito Juárez. So they represented Benito Juárez as an international hero of Hispanic democracy. So there is this third way. And I think there is also a genealogy from this democratic cult to Latin American revolutionaries until our days. Because if you see today Hispanic radical left, if you study the discourses of Pablo Iglesias, Íñigo Errejón, they have also, well, they have also given a lot of importance to the left-wing movements that, well, that took power in Latin America during their 2000 decade. So there is this third way, and we must study it, well, deeper. Well, I will answer also to your third question through this one, because in the Spanish public sphere, there are Latin American intellectuals that have some importance. For example, Rafael María Baral, that is, as you probably know, is a Venezuelan intellectual who had been an important deputy and minister in Venezuela, who traveled to Spain and stayed there during the 40s and the 50s and began to collaborate with the Democratic Party. And he published articles and he published also some books that will defend a version, a much more republican, anti-monarchical, constitutionalist, pro-independence version of the history of the empire in Spain. And he would be very successful among the publics of republican political culture. He also will publish a lot of poems about Bolivar. And it's very interesting because in some spheres of Spanish public opinion, in the 30s and in the 40s, it's obvious that there is a kind of romanticization of the figure of Bolivar and of some heroes of Latin American independence. So this forms part of this third way of interpreting the Latin American revolutions. And about your second question, I think that precisely the 1830s and the 1840s are the moment when the Spanish liberal thought introduced racial concepts. I mean, Spanish liberal conservatives and Spanish progresistas begin to use systematically the language of race for explaining, for example, the exclusion of Cuba and Puerto Rico from the constitutional order that will operate in Spain from 1837. However, there are actors that would defend mestizaje. And those authors are mostly traditionalist authors. I think in the 6th chapter, I study a very interesting dispute between Francisco Pacheco in his newspaper El Conservador, that, well, in an article he says, the problem of Mexico is that the Spanish race and the indigenous race are not predisposed for democratic participation. They need order. They need a very strong government. And he used the concept of race as the main explanatory factor. Sorry. And then in another journal called El Católico, Jaime Balmes, that, as you probably know, is a traditionalist thinker, would answer Pacheco. No, the Spanish Empire is not a question of race, because there is not an inherent political behavior to any race.
is not a relevant factor to explain the decline of Spain or Mexico. The real important factor, the really important identitarian and political element that united the Spanish monarchy was Catholicism. And Balmes says, the Spanish Empire has had the ability to mix races and to join them through Catholic cult. So the problem with Mexico and with Spain nowadays is not that the Spanish race is not prepared for democracy. The problem is that they are abandoning their Catholic culture and they are exchanging it by liberal individualism that is destroying the networks that join, well, as you know, the atomic elements of social order as family and as the corporate bodies that configure the political system of the monarchy. So there is this emergence of a racist language in Spanish liberalism, and the only tendency that would not be racist until the end of the century would be traditionalism, curiously, Catholic traditionalism.
Fantastic, Rodrigo. There's a question from Michelle Prain, and perhaps should be the last question because we have gone over the deadline. So, Michelle,
Sorry.
please go ahead. No, it's not your
Sorry
problem.
Yes, my problem because I have very bad luck. Hello, Michelle.
Hello, Rodrigo. Yes, I have a question. Looking at your research from Chile and Latin America, I wonder if you can tell us more about your theoretical frame. I mean, how you have been dealing with this situation of trans-imperialism and entanglement. And because entangled history, as Graciela has put it in her book, right, seems to be a very useful historiographical approach for us, right?
Well, a very interesting question. It was really not very difficult for me because the texts that I studied are entangled. I mean, because when I read Argüelles, he mentioned the works of Callcott. He mentioned the works of Lord Holland. When I read Lord Holland, he, construct some counter arguments to the text of Martínez de la Rosa. And Martínez de la Rosa would cite the diary of Maria Graham as an informational resource for understanding the Republican process in Chile. So really what I have done is like, well, I have a very complex theoretical framework, political cultures, all of that, but mostly it's a contextual approach. And the thing is that this contextual approach from the new intellectual history has conducted me to naturally to find this Anglo-Hispanic dialogue. It's not so difficult because they are constantly referencing each other. In Spain, they have read everything that the British authors are publishing. They have read Carlyle, they have read Callcott, they have read Mary Margaret Bass, they have read Harriet Martineau. Some important British scholars would come to Spain to study in the archive of the Indies, as MacGregor, for example, James MacGregor. And the same with Spanish intellectuals. They will travel, and a very important fact is the exile. Consider that most of the most important liberal intellectuals of Spain would be in exile in London or Paris during the 1820s. So they obviously are bilingual or trilingual, and they are living in that London where you can find the leaders of Latin American independence that are negotiating with Westminster the recognition of the republics. You can find, obviously, the British intellectuals, some of them very influenced by some lobbies of the city that want to have a new influence over Latin American trade. For example, James Mackintosh, that is a very important writer that would defend a weak version of the history of Spain and Spanish America in the parliament. He is an agent of the city. I mean, the city pays him so he can defend the recognition of Latin American independence against the government, in front of the government, and in the parliament. So my methodology is very sophisticated. I have a lot of different concepts that I use to explain these entanglements and this comparative also approach that I have tried. But really, the object of a study has been very good for that approach, because there exists historically this entanglement, these connections. So it's as easy as to see the sites, the references, the discussion of Spanish intellectuals with British intellectuals and Latin American intellectuals. It's a very, very connected intellectual context. Maybe more connected, much more connected than 21st century scholarly discussions. That is also very interesting.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So I think we have to bring the meeting to an end, and it has been fantastic conversation, and really we have learned enormously. And thank you very much, Rodrigo, and thank you very much, James, also for setting us in the conversation. It was really very, very enlightening. And just to tell to those who are attending that the Modern History Research Center organizes regular talks. And if you want to be in our mailing list, just, if you are not already in the mailing list, just email me to mhrc@winchester.ac.uk, and I'll put you in the mailing list so you can attend other talks that are coming up. Just to say thank you very much, and hope that you go all and buy the book now, if you have not done it already.
It's cheap. It's as you
Good.
can see.
Well
Beautiful.
done. Well done.
So, thank you very much, Graciela.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James.
Thank you. Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Que vaya muy bien.